Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 314, The End of the Valois Dynasty. Henri and his mother left Avignon on January the 10th, 1575, and headed north on a journey that would lead him to Reims for his coronation and marriage. The journey north was a depressing reminder of the devastation of the wars of religion. Both the land and the peasants themselves were terribly scarred from years of civil strife and war. Further depressing news followed. As they traveled, Henri received word of a plot to kidnap him. The plot itself was mostly driven by local Huguenot lords, but might also have involved his younger brother. Henri detested his younger brother and had no difficulty in jumping to the conclusion that he had been intimately involved in the plot. Henri had even previously told Henry of Navarre that should he die, Henry was to seize the throne, for Alencon must never become the king of France. The coronation itself took place on February 13th, 1575. It was a muted affair. Henri knew the task before him was daunting to say the least. Years of financial mismanagement and outright corruption had left the French economy in tatters. Moreover, Europe was, in general, suffering through what we today might call a financial depression. For years now, massive quantities of Spanish gold and silver had been flowing from the Americas into Europe. This drove inflation to runaway levels, while simultaneously fueling the wars that would continue to plague Europe for the next 200 years or so. Henri immediately applied for loans abroad and moved to tax the middle class. The peasants had already been taxed so heavily that they could barely afford to eat as it was. These measures raised a quick 3 million livres. However, unfortunately, Henry was no scion of economics and instantly gave away 50,000 of this to his favorites for no good reason. Catherine urged her son to deal with the financial quagmire, but as he began to realize the magnitude of the problem, he quickly lost interest. Henri left the governing to his mother and royal council, which he rarely attended. Instead, the king spent his time hunting and pursuing other leisure activities. The Parisians saw all this and, needless to say, did not endear them to their king. Apart from leisure, Henri did engage actively in one aspect of kingship: intrigue. He spent as much time as he could trying to drive a wedge between Margaret, Navarre, and Alencon to destroy their trust in one another. To an extent, this was good policy, as Henry could hardly afford to formulate state policy while simultaneously fearing for his life and or crown. But the fact of the matter remains, Henry never did any of that, so he could pursue reasonable policy, and as a result, all of this was rather pointless. In 1575, France remained a deeply divided kingdom. Henri faced threats from two fronts. One was from the Huguenots. The other was a group of disaffected nobles, mainly from Languedoc, who wanted to see major reforms, both religious and otherwise. These men called themselves the Politiques. In April, a delegation of these arrived in Paris to present their grievances to the king. These included a Bill of Rights, complete religious freedom, and a demand for those responsible for St. Bartholomew's Day to be held accountable. Henri thought all these requests were insane and left the delegation in a huff. As a result, sporadic fighting in the countryside continued, with neither side gaining any sort of decisive advantage. The Venetian ambassador described his impressions of France at the time as follows: "Everywhere one sees ruin, the livestock for the most part destroyed, stretches of good land uncultivated, and many peasants forced to leave their homes to become vagabonds. Everything has risen to exorbitant prices. People are no longer loyal and courteous, either because poverty had broken their spirit and brutalized them, or because the factions and bloodshed had made them vicious and ferocious. The clergy and the nobility, for various reasons, are also in hard circumstances, but particularly the nobility, or completely ruined and indebted. Those who still have some pulse of life are the bourgeoisie, traders, and the class known as the gens de robe longue, magistrates, councillors, treasurers, and the like, who spend little and know how to husband their resources and wait to devour the others. Religion and justice have fallen into the utmost abuse. I should say that many care very little for religion and use it for their own purposes. Demoralized, the people have lost their supreme reverence and obedience for the king, which was once so great that they would have given him not only their lives and their property, but their souls and their honor. As for obedience to the royal orders and edicts, they seem to make sport of them." End quote. Things got worse for Henri when, on the night of September 15th, 1575, his younger brother Alencon managed to escape from Paris. Henri had essentially been keeping his brother locked up in a gilded cage, of course, so that he could not stir up trouble elsewhere. The king tried to gather a group of nobles to pursue the fleeing prince, but no one was willing to follow. Almost immediately upon crossing the border into the Netherlands, Alencon started making trouble for Henri. He issued a manifesto that repeated many of the delegation's demands, the delegation of the politiques. He wanted a full religious ceasefire. He wanted the Estates General called. And he wanted all foreigners expelled from the Royal Council. I'm not even sure the first one was within Henri's power, but he certainly wasn't going to agree to the second two. Catherine left Paris immediately to try to meet with Alencon and talk him down. In Germany, a Protestant army was rapidly approaching the border and looked like it might be a serious problem for Henri. As said army bore down on France, Catherine met with her youngest son at Blois on September the 29th. She was under strict instructions to concede little to Alencon, but at the same time, she was desperate to get a deal done that might reconcile the brothers and at least present the veneer of unity as the Valois monarchy tattered on the edge of collapse. Luckily, Henry, Duke of Guise, won a battle against the advancing Germans on October the 10th, buying King Henri at least a little more time to prepare for war. On November the 21st, both sides signed a 6-month truce, but no one kept the truce at all. On January 9th, 1576, only 2 months later, the Germans advanced into Lorraine. More bad news followed. Navarre, on February the 3rd, escaped his confinement and fled back to his kingdom in the Pyrenees. He had essentially been held in captivity since his marriage 4 years earlier. On June 13th, he abjured the Catholic faith. With everything quite literally collapsing around them, Catherine begged her son to accept peace at just about any price. The king finally agreed, and on May the 6th, the two sides signed the Peace of Valois. This 63-article treaty represented nothing less than a triumph for French Protestantism, which now was virtually on par with Catholicism. Alencon, among other valuable lands and titles, received the dukedom of Anjou. This is actually when he becomes the Duke of Anjou, for record. Coligny and the victims of St. Bartholomew were posthumously rehabilitated, and the massacre was publicly condemned as a crime. Pensions were to be paid to the widows and orphans of the victims for 6 years. 8 surety towns were granted to the Protestants, and the German forces, the Reiters as they're called, were promised a generous payoff to get the heck out of France. Navarre received the governorship of Guyenne, and monies owed to him were to be paid back with interest. The king also agreed to call a meeting of the Estates General within 6 months. The treaty had been an utter humiliation for Henri, and he reportedly wept when he had to sign it. But it did allow him to keep his throne. The treaty also heralded a major change in Catherine's relationship with her favorite son. He no longer trusted her. He'd be cordial in public, but by and large he kept his own counsel. The glorious reign that both Catherine and Henri had expected had evaporated, and behind that mist lay only a nightmare. The peace treaty caused a tidal wave of rage and disbelief to wash over French Catholics. Humiliated by Henri, they no longer believed they could look to their king for protection. Instead, they began forming leagues of their own to protect their own interests. The meeting of the Estates General that had been stipulated in the treaty was to take place in December 1576. And as the League continued to spread through all classes of society, it became obvious that they intended to hijack the assembly for their own purposes, filling it with delegates faithful to this new party. Despite their protestations of loyalty to the king, they intended to make their fealty conditional upon his agreeing to abide by the estate's decisions, which, of course, would be Catholic-leaning. Seeing that the whole assembly was to be dominated by Catholic zealots elected through rigged ballots, the Huguenots and the Politiques declared that they were not going to be attending and that any decisions of this Estates General would be invalid. Now, the obvious leader of the League was Henri, Duke of Guise. He was, of course, the obvious choice, as the Guise were the arch-Catholic family of France. The only positive result of the formation of the Leagues was the reconciliation between Henri and Alencon. The brothers agreed to put aside their differences with no strings attached on either side. This was an emergency, and both men were willing to recognize it as such. While Catherine hoped that they could still avoid war, she constantly urged Henri to prepare for one. In a last-ditch effort to avoid the looming conflict, Henri invited the warring factions to Blois to work things out. Everyone declined. Given what happened on St. Bartholomew's Day, I'm not sure I blame them. The short-lived Sixth, if you're keeping track at home, War of Religion followed. It was not particularly long, but it was brutal. On May 2nd, 1577, Alencon captured the Huguenot stronghold of La Charite-sur-Loire and ordered all Huguenots within massacred. In June, he did the exact same thing at the town of Auvergne. There, he presided personally over the murder of 3,000 unarmed citizens. The war quickly ended in September 1577 with the Peace of Berajac. It removed some of the more onerous terms of the prior treaty, but still no one was fully satisfied. But the fact of the matter was, the king could not continue paying for the war. The Protestants had been mauled, but had by no means been fully beaten. In order to keep Henri's faith in her, Catherine set off on a tour of the largely Protestant sections of the kingdom, the south and southwest. Catherine witnessed all the myriad problems besetting France as she traveled. Religion was one, but so was taxation, and social strife, and local disputes. It was a rough time for France. Catherine put herself at considerable risk in this progress, but she felt strongly that people needed to see and hear from a royal representative, which is what she was. At one point, she drove her carriage straight through 2 rows of Huguenot arquebusiers, who moved in menacingly as she advanced. Afterwards, however, the men indicated how impressed they had been with her composure and courage. France might fail, but Catherine was determined that it not be her fault. But if the end of the House of Blois was not her fault directly, certainly her children were not doing Catherine any favors. Even before she had left Henri and Alencon, the two had fallen out with one another. Before Catherine had hardly reached Languedoc, Alencon had once more fled Paris, though immediately he wrote to his mother, indicating that he would do absolutely nothing to threaten the precarious peace. Catherine responded to the turn of events by attempting, yet again, to find a wife for her youngest son. The queen, after all, showed no signs of producing an heir, which meant that Alencon was now the heir to the throne, and if he wed and produced children, then at least the Valois line would be secure going forward. Other natural catastrophes hammered the realm in 1580. In April, the already devastated country was hit by an earthquake at Calais, which could be felt as far away as Paris. A few days later, terrible storms caused serious flooding in the capital. 3 epidemics ravaged France that same year. The first, which also reached Italy and England, struck in February. The second, described as a disease that sounds like cholera, afflicted Paris in June. Catherine, Henri, and the Duke of Guise and many other important figures at court fell ill, but all survived. The symptoms were described by the historian Déthue. Quote, "First the malady struck the base of the spine with shivering, followed by a heaviness of the head and weakness in the limbs. This was accompanied by strong chest pain. If the patient had not recovered by the third or fourth day, fever would set in, and in almost all cases prove fatal." The French called the illness la colique. Just as the epidemic waned, the plague paid its almost annual summer visit to the capital in July. In 1580, the disease spread with unusual force and rapidity, and anyone who had the means abandoned the city. Catherine traveled to Saint-Marc. The king went to Olavie, as the epidemic claimed the lives of hundreds of people every single day. In Paris, deserted but for the poorest inhabitants, the unguarded houses of the rich were looted by those who were left behind, and even the Louvre Palace itself was robbed. The estimated total number of dead from these natural disasters varies from 30,000 all the way up to 140,000 victims throughout France, far more than died in the violent uprisings and means of the period. In the autumn of 1580, just as the peace that ended the Sixth War of Religion was being signed, Alejandro Farnese, the Duke of Parma, led a force of Spanish troops to besiege Cambrai. Upon hearing the news in the Netherlands, Alencon, overseeing the tiresome and difficult terms of the treaty, could hardly wait for an excuse to get away, and nobly announced that he must immediately go to the aid of the people he had pledged to protect. After all, he had recently been named the defender of liberty of the Netherlands against the tyranny of the Spaniards and their allies. He now fancied himself the protector of the Low Countries, and set about raising a force to come to their aid, much to the chagrin of Henri, Catherine, and basically everyone in France. But yet Alencon went anyway, and after his glorious acclamation upon arrival as Duke of Brabant, he was finding life in Antwerp a little difficult. He complained constantly that his brother didn't give him enough money to fight off the Spaniards. When King Henri did send funds, Alencon soon found out it was never enough. His men suffered from malnutrition, lack of pay, and had even resorted to begging from the inhabitants. Their numbers dwindled as they began deserting or dying. By late 1582, he wrote, quote, "Everything is falling apart in ruin, and the worst part of it is that I was given hopes which have led me too far to back down now. Thus, I say, it would be better to promise me only a little money and keep your word than to promise so much and not send anything at all." On the 17th of January, 1583, to the embarrassment of everyone, especially his mother and brother, and the horror of everyone else in the European courts, Alencon and his men rose up and attempted to take Antwerp from the Dutch, in what was later described as the French Fury. It failed. There were further attempts at both Bruges and Gand, but these were put down without difficulty. When Alencon finally came home and reunited with his mother in mid-July 1583, it was clear that his health was fading. Alencon and Henry were briefly united to celebrate Carnival together in March 1584, but upon returning home from the festivities, Alencon fell desperately ill, vomiting blood and convulsing. Catherine rushed to his side. Alencon is suffering the final stages of what today we call tuberculosis and what was then called consumption. Still, somehow, Catherine managed to convince herself that her son was recovering. She left his bedside around the end of May 1584. On June the 10th of that same year, Alencon, her youngest son, died. And so there was no plan B. Unless Henri produced an heir, the Valois line, which had ruled France since 1284, would end. And the next king of France would be the heretic Bourbon king, Henry of Navarre. Catherine had hardly buried her son when the storm broke. News of Alencon's death galvanized French Catholics into action. The Duke of Guise declared a new Holy Catholic League with the express purpose of eliminating Protestantism in France and, by any means necessary, preventing Henri of Navarre from assuming the throne. Guise reached out to Philip of Spain for aid, and the League signed a treaty of support with Spain during the first days of 1585. From the moment of Alencon's death, Henri had made it clear that he viewed his brother-in-law as his legal successor, declaring, quote, "I recognize the King of Navarre as my sole and only heir. He is a prince of good birth and good parts. I have always been inclined to like him, and I know that he likes me. He is a little sharp and choleric, but at bottom he is a good man. I feel certain that my disposition will please him and that we shall agree very well." He further went on to write to Navarre, warning him, quote, "My brother, this is to notify you that whatever resistance I have made, I have not been able to prevent the mischievous designs of the Duke of Guise. He is under arms. Be on your guard and make no move. I shall send a gentleman to advise you of my will. Your good brother, Henri." As the unmistakable signs of rebellion from the ultra-Catholics grew, Henri, in a public statement to the Provost of Merchants, supported Henry of Navarre, the first Prince of the Blood. Quote, "I am highly pleased with the conduct of my cousin of Navarre. There are those who are trying to supplant him, but I shall take good care to prevent them from succeeding. I find it very strange, moreover, that any dispute should arise as to who is to be my successor, as if it were a question of admitting doubt or dispute." End quote. Henri supported Navarre in the hope that the latter would eventually convert to Catholicism. For the moment, at least, Navarre was hesitant, given that the Huguenots provided him with his largest base of support. But Navarre's religion will continue to be an issue that we need to watch. Remember, he has already converted and reconverted several times in his life. One more, and he gets a set of steak knives. Meanwhile, the network of Catholic leagues continued to grow. Guise was in overall command, but significant numbers of Spanish troops and Spanish arms were now flowing across the border from the Netherlands. By the spring of 1585, Guise had amassed a fighting force of around 27,000 men. France was now effectively split in two. The north and center were controlled by the League. The south and west were mainly Protestant, and for our purposes, I'm going to say royalist. Henri had responded to Guise's army by hiring scores of Swiss mercenaries. He still hoped to avoid yet another religious war. Soon we'll be in double digits if we're not careful. And so dispatched his mother to negotiate with the Duke of Guise on April the 1st, 1585. The two met on Easter Sunday, about a week later. While Guise flattered Catherine, she feared he was merely playing for time and warned her son that he needed to prepare for war. In the end, the negotiations failed. Guise proceeded to Verdun, where Catherine sent a message to Henri of Navarre asking him to meet her for talks. Navarre had just led his army to a victory over the League in Bordeaux and Marseille. This prompted Guise to hurry back to the Queen Mother, but his demands were so extortionate that even the Cardinal de Bourbon, who was also present, wrote, quote, "The Queen talks of peace, but we ask for so much that I do not think our demands will be granted." For as long as she could, Catherine resisted contemplating a coalition, or more realistically, I suppose, a capitulation, between the League and the Crown, for fear that the king would become their puppet. She also worried about his safety, especially when word arrived that League forces were not far from the capital and would march on the city on the Duke's command. Paris itself was notoriously pro-League, and Catherine believed that the city gates would be thrown open to welcome its army. She wrote to her son, "Take care, especially about your person. There is so much treachery around that I die of fear." Though Henry was surrounded by his Swiss guards, though, he was trapped. And by early May, the realization dawned on Catherine that, for the moment at least, the king had to come to some kind of terms with the League and the Guise family. Hoping that he could sidestep any treaty that would prove as unenforceable as many of the earlier agreements with the Protestants had been, he therefore signed the Treaty of Nemours on the 7th of July, 1585. In broad terms, this revoked all previous edicts of pacification and effectively banned Protestantism in France. As a heretic, Navarre was thus banned from inheriting the throne, and many towns were given over to the League, or generally to Guise loyalists. When Navarre received the terms of the treaty, it is said that half of his mustache turned white overnight. Clearly, he would once more have to fight for his rights and those of his co-religionists. On July the 18th, King Henri officially removed Navarre from the line of succession. This went against everything he believed in. From a legal standpoint, Navarre should inherit the throne, and Henri had no sense that he could alter that. Moreover, he liked Navarre, and he hated the Duke of Guise, with whom he now found himself forcibly allied. In September, the Pope issued a bull excommunicating Navarre and denying the right of succession to any Protestant princes of the blood. Navarre responded boldly and hilariously by excommunicating the Pope. From what? I'm not sure. What followed next is what historians call the War of the Three Henrys, Valois, Guise, and Navarre. It's a confusing conflict of personal distrust, belief, and animosity. Henri played arguably the smallest role in the conflict, given that the monarchy was, essentially, bankrupt. While Navarre, playing for time, held futile talks with Catherine, he was also amassing a considerable army, which included Lutheran mercenaries from Jean Casimir, the King of Denmark, to counter the threat of Spanish troops from the Low Countries. Almost immediately after signing the Treaty of Nemours, Navarre and Condé had met at Danville and reformed their alliance with moderate Catholics. Navarre's plan was pretty straightforward here. He must fight for his right to the French throne, and he needed a decisive victory over the League. He had to crush the Guises and their ambitions, and that would reestablish a proper place in the succession. He knew he couldn't rely on Henri for any of this. The king was too weak and virtually a captive of the ultra-Catholics. He couldn't impose his will on anything. In fact, at this point, I'm going to be clear, King Henri III had effectively checked out. He had taken to spending most of his days either walking from Paris to Chartres on foot, about 100 miles, by the way, or spending hours upon hours in prayer and self-mortification. To the Parisians, the Duke of Guise was king in all but name. This all happened, by the way, at the exact same time that Mary Stuart is being found guilty of treason. Catherine is appalled at that and sends emissaries, as we know, to beg for mercy, but we all know how that turns out. After Mary's death, Philip threw himself ever more into the War of the Three Henrys, because the idea was he wanted France pacified before he launches his invasion of England, backed up by his armada, but again, we know how that turns out. Neither did this war go Philip's way. On October 20th, 1587, at the Battle of Coutras, Henry of Navarre routed the forces led by the Spanish. Their commander, the Duke of Joyeux, was killed. Guise fought 2 successful battles against the German Reiters, those mercenaries, at Vimroy on the 26th of October and Anjou in the 24th of November. Though by this time, frankly, the mercenaries were already retreating, having been bribed by King Henri to leave French soil. But none of this was the decisive victory that Philip and his ultra-Catholic Guise allies expected. And so that winter, all of France hunkered down. The south and west were still in Navarre's control. No one had won a truly decisive victory. Once again, the only losers here had been the peasants, whose fields had been yet again destroyed. It was, in effect, another cold, hungry winter for France. Even the Parisians had had enough. They blamed Guise and Henri for what looked like a costly war that had accomplished absolutely nothing. With the country effectively split into two states, the Protestants held the territories in the south and the League in the north and central, France now produced a oftentimes conflicting foreign policy. Though France was bound by a defensive alliance with England, the League had allied itself to Spain and the international fight against quote-unquote heresy, and must therefore aid in the planned attack against England. The Guises, helped by the Duke of Parma from the Netherlands, seized Picardy, but were unable to capture Boulogne. Philip, quote, by whose Greece he, Guise, lives, required channel ports and their hinterland for his invasion fleet and men. He also needed to be absolutely sure the king would not come to the aid of Elizabeth in any way or obstruct his offensive. Accordingly, it had been planned that, whipped up by the League preachers and the Parisians, the king would be taken captive by a popular uprising led by the League and neutralized as a political force shortly before the Armada itself was launched. By spring 1588, the League was actively now plotting against their own king, Henri III. The plan seems to have now been to murder Henri and Catherine in a sort of St. Bartholomew's Day coup, but in reverse, and then take the Duke of Guise and set him on the throne. Catherine, desperately sick at this point from gout, warned her son, but she could do little else. Ironically, the Parisians likewise believed that Henri had now allied with Navarre, and that Navarre was heading to Paris with an army to massacre all the Catholics. This wasn't remotely true, but it shows you just how paranoid everything had gotten. Guise and Henri met in early May to try to work things out, but there was too much mutual suspicion for the talks to gain any traction. Instead, on May the 11th, King Henri, in the dead of the night, ordered his Swiss mercenaries into the city. He thought he was doing this to protect himself. The Parisians thought he was doing it so he could have them all killed. Massive crowds formed the next morning, forcing Henri to move his guard back outside the city once more. And then, the next day, on May the 12th, King Henri, against his mother's advice, fled the city. Parliament was due to convene the next day, but despite Guise's command, it refused to open the session. There were still enough moderate Catholics loyal to the king, despite all his weaknesses, to hold the center against extremism. Guise now effectively took control of the government in Paris. He never wanted to murder Henri, as an aside, just rule through him. The League sent a delegation to negotiate with Henri in mid-May, and these discussions proceeded to consume several weeks. At Rouen, on the 5th of July 1588, the king finally accepted the League's demands, and Parliament published the Act of Union in Paris on the 21st of July. In it, the League received official recognition, although Henri insisted it break all its foreign alliances immediately. He had in mind the growing trouble from Spain, as well as the Armada, which had now set forth from Lisbon against England and was even now skirting the French coast. This flotilla, a solid equivocation of Spanish naval might, provided an unsettling reminder of Guise's semi-client relationship with Philip II. Catherine, in particular, stuck in Paris, had always feared an attack by Spain. She had grown restless in her isolation and fearful lest Henry's delays provoke an attack by her seemingly unstoppable former son-in-law, the Duke of Guise. The Act of Union made the Cardinal de Bourbon Henry's heir presumptive, and his subjects had henceforth to give an undertaking never to allow a heretic, that is, a Protestant, to succeed the king. Guise then also became lieutenant general. Now, Philip himself back in Spain would have rejoiced at the news had it not been for the fact that his great armada was destroyed a month later. With Guise's main supporter dramatically weakened, King Henri seemed to believe the time was now ripe for a return to moderation. On September the 8th, he fired all the ultra-Catholic ministers Guise had put in place and had been put in place via the Act of Union. Then, King Henri made an even more dramatic move that shocked everyone, including Catherine. On December the 23rd, he had the powerful Duke of Guise assassinated in the royal chambers. Henri isn't remembered as a particularly effective king, but this one thing he managed to pull off pretty well. The day of the assassination, Guise was informed that he was finally going to get the appointment he had always wanted, the Constable of France. But when the royal curtains were pulled back for him to walk down the passageway out of the chamber, 8 murderers stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the way. Guise was stabbed so many times, he was dead within seconds. Henri is reported to have sneered down at his great enemy, quote, "Look at him, the king of Paris, not so big now." The Cardinal of Guise was arrested moments later, and on Christmas morning, he was murdered in his jail cell. On Christmas Day, Catherine, though deeply depressed and in despair over what her son had done, spoke to a local friar begging him to pray for Henri, saying, quote, "Oh, wretched man, what has he done? Pray for him. He needs your prayers. He is headed toward ruin, and I fear he will lose his body, his soul, and his kingdom." End quote. The Guises had posed the greatest danger to Henri's dynasty ever since his death, but when they finally met their doom, Catherine quickly realized that the way her son had acted in such savagery would bring down both of their houses. In the end, it was all for naught. On the morning of January the 5th, 1589, Catherine de Medici died. She had been the wife of one king of France and the mother of 3 others. While she possessed, certainly, significant political acumen, she is forever remembered as the dark architect of St. Bartholomew's Day. Now, by the summer of 1589, Henri was now openly allied with Navarre against the Catholic League, bereft of its leader, but still very much alive. The League held Paris, but the king was determined to retake the capital. But then, events intervened. On the 31st of July, a Dominican friar was spotted walking on the road to St. Cloud and was stopped by the king's attorney general, who happened to be passing. When asked what business he had at the king's headquarters, the monk introduced himself as Jacques Clement and said that he had come from Paris with information, quote, "of great moment," end quote, for his majesty. He then produced a letter of introduction that appeared genuine, so the attorney general conducted him to St. Cloud, where he was told to wait for a possible audience. In fact, the Dominican friar was a delusional loner who believed that he could actually hear God's voice in his head and that he had received instructions for the Almighty to kill the king. Henri, always pleased to welcome a man of God, and especially one carrying news from loyalists in Paris, agreed to see him at 8 o'clock the following morning. That evening, the monk dined with the attorney general and his companions. He proved to be a really fun guest, who, those present later recalled, cut his meat with his own sharp knife as he chatted about the latest news from the rebel capital. The next morning, the attorney general fetched the monk for his audience with Henri. The guards, inexplicably, failed to search the assassin before he was ushered into the royal presence, and after a few further questions, which seemed to satisfy everyone that he was indeed bringing vital news to the king, he found himself being conducted into Henri's private cabinet. The king was actually only half dressed and, believe it or not, actually just sitting on the toilet when the monk entered. He greeted him with the words, "Mon frère, you are welcome. What news of Paris?" Ignoring protests from those present, Henri insisted that the monk draw near to impart the information. The monk kissed the king's hand and gave him a letter of introduction. Henri asked for further news and letters, motioning the monk closer to whisper in his ear. The monk bent low as though to produce the correspondence, but instead his hand emerged from his sleeve with a knife, which he plunged up to the hilt into the king's lower abdomen. Henri stood up crying, "Ah, my God, the wretch has wounded me." He pulled the knife out of his stomach and punched the monk twice in the face as his bodyguards fell upon the assassin, stabbing him. The guards then threw the monk's body out the window. Henry, bleeding profusely, was left standing with the killer's knife in his one hand and his own intestines in the other. At first, the king felt little discomfort and spoke in a strong voice. The surgeons attending him seemed optimistic as they replaced the intestines protruding from the wound, though their royal patient fainted from the pain. Once they had finished bandaging him up, Charles IX's illegitimate son, Charles of Angoulême, a young man much loved by the king, had arrived in the chamber as this gruesome operation was taking place, and he began to weep openly when he saw what had happened to his beloved uncle. Regaining consciousness, Henri stroked the boy's head and comforted him. He said, quote, my son, do not grieve. They have tried to kill me, but by God's mercy they have not succeeded. This will be nothing. I shall soon be better." With this, he slipped his fingers under the bandage that protruded the wound to ensure that his intestines were indeed intact. One of the king's surgeons, unable to share his colleague's positive prognosis, took the 16-year-old boy aside and whispered that he feared the injury would, in fact, prove fatal. By 10 o'clock, the king, lying on his bed, issued orders for the news of his wounding and hopes for his recovery to be sent to the provincial governors. He also, though, complained of cold and numbness in his feet. Mass was held by the king's bed, and afterward he dictated a letter to the queen, telling her about the attempt on his life. The king also issued an order to summon Navarre, who, by this time he arrived at the king's bedside, could have absolutely no illusions about what was going to happen next. Having slept on and off during the early afternoon, the king had become feverish and vomited a large quantity of blood. With the fever came excruciating pain. Understanding all too well that he didn't have too many hours left to live, the king became anxious to take the sacrament. But first, turning to the nobility in the room, he addressed Navarre, quote, "It is now for you, my brother, to wear the crown which I have striven to preserve for you. Justice and the principle of legitimacy demand that you should succeed me in the realm. You will experience many calamities unless you resolve to change your religion." End quote. Navarre was physically moved, everyone could tell, but he didn't say anything. The king then demanded that his officers and nobles pledge their oath of allegiance to the man who would shortly be their sovereign, stating that this sight would comfort him greatly. Kneeling at the king's bed, they all duly gave their promise of loyalty to Navarre. Once this was done, Navarre, who was weeping, received the king's benedictions and withdrew with everyone else. The king, exhausted, slept for a few hours. When he awoke, he cried, "My time has come." After making his confession, he received last rites and died 2 hours later, at 4 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of office, from perforated intestines and, of course, severe internal bleeding. As he died, so did at last the Valois dynasty. The Valois became yet another casualty of the wars of religion. In fact, believe it or not, we are just at the beginning of what is going to be an extremely bloody 100 of years for Europe. The Valois dynasty ran almost exactly 300 years. And in the end, it's interesting that it met such a similar end compared to the Capetian line. In both cases, there should have been plenty of heirs and spares to keep the line going. But a series of events, unfortunate, I suppose, depending on your point of view, brought the dynasty to a close. And that brings us now to the final French royal dynasty. I'm not counting Napoleon, FYI. I'm talking, of course, the Bourbons. But next week, before we turn to Henry of Navarre, the future king of France, we're going to rotate back to England and bring England up to speed in 2 episodes that will also bring to a close the Tudor dynasty. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to check out the links in the show notes to the website and also to the Patreon page, which is the best way to provide support.